its standout successes have really been what it has achieved in the Black Sea with attacks on Russian shipping. We've seen them using both cruise missiles, Storm Shadow and Scout cruise missiles, which were donated by Britain and France, and also its own domestically produced swarming sea drones to attack vessels both in dock and at sea. And that has forced Russia to move its Black Sea fleet east, away from Crimea, particularly away from the key Ukrainian port city of Odessa. And by doing so, Ukraine has effectively allowed itself to keep trading by funneling merchant vessels close to its shore and then hugging the territorial water of its neighbours once it's out of Ukrainian waters.
The UK is prepared to do whatever it takes to support Ukraine. That's the message from Rishi Sunak, the Prime Minister, on the second anniversary of the Russian invasion. He's pledged nearly £250 million to help Ukraine restock its supply of artillery shells. Let's go now to the city of Kharkiv in northeastern Ukraine and speak to Jerome Starkey, who's defence editor of The Sun. Jerome, good morning.
Morning, Callum.
Good to speak to you. I think it's always helpful to sort of put the locations we speak of into context. And so Kharkiv, is fairly close to the Russian border. It's been under pretty constant shelling. Just put it in its context today, 2 years since the full-scale invasion.
Yeah, that's right. Well, I mean, as you say, just 15 miles the edge of the city to the Russian border. And before the war, this is a city that had very close links to Russia, indeed to its sister city, Belgorod, on the other side of the border. But on the first day of the full-scale invasion, exactly 2 years ago, Kharkiv repelled a Russian tank assault. Tanks were on the ring road, Russian tanks destroyed on the ring road of this city. And since then, it has suffered, it's endured an almost daily and nightly bombardment by a combination of Russian artillery, rockets, missiles, and drone strikes. During the first year of the war, Ukrainian forces managed to push the Russian invaders back from the city limits, and indeed Russia's front lines around Kharkiv collapsed in the autumn of 2022 in one of the most spectacular defeats that Russian forces have suffered during the war. But nonetheless, its proximity to Russia means that this city is always within range of Russian weapons. And so for the 3 or 4 days that I've been up here now, there hasn't been a single day, a single night that my sleep hasn't been disturbed by the air raid sirens. The threat of Russian attacks is a constant. And indeed, one of the things we've done while we've been here is to meet children who are now going to school underground. The city's converted 5 of its metro stations into underground schools. And that tells us a couple of things. It's a measure of the desperate needs, the desperate measures that are needed because of what is happening here. But I think it's also a sign of the city's resilience. There are, many people still living here. Most of the schools have been forced to close and pupils are learning remotely, but there is a craving for teachers and pupils to be taught face-to-face, and they're finding ways around it. I mean, when I was first here 2 years ago, there were tens of thousands of people living in those metro stations, but most of those people have now returned to their homes or they've left the city for somewhere safer. But, many families are still here. And as I say, some of them are educating their children underground.
The resilience and adaptability is astonishing and remarkable in so many ways. But does it similarly feel like a city that is fatigued by this war?
There is a sense of weariness, a really palpable sense of weariness. I felt that when I met the city's mayor a few days ago, but it's weariness combined with determination. People are tired, they're exhausted. The mayor, described to me the aftermath of a recent strike in which 7 people had been burned alive after a missile hit an oil depot. And he said 3 of those 7 people were children, including a 10-month-old baby. It's impossible for news like that not to take a toll on the people who have to deal with it on a fairly frequent basis. But there's also a sense for many people that Ukraine doesn't have a choice. This isn't a war of choice. If Ukraine loses, it stands to lose potentially everything. And therefore, as we hear, you mentioned Rishi Sunak talking about giving Ukraine more money for more ammunition and supporting Ukraine for as long as it takes. there's a realization here, and indeed in some Western capitals, that this is now a war of attrition and endurance. The winner will likely be the side that is prepared to fight the longest, not just prepared, but also resourced to fight the longest. And the warning from Western officials that I heard just last week was that they believe Russia and Vladimir Putin remains hell-bent on conquering all of Ukraine. He hasn't given up on that initial ambition, despite the eye-watering losses that Russia has suffered. He seems prepared. Moscow seems prepared just to simply slog it out. And unfortunately, that tactic, that strategy rather, of slogging it out is gaining Russia small incremental gains. But those are, over the last 12 months, the only real gains we've seen on the battlefield. And I point you to, the bomb-blitzed ruins of Bakhmut, which Russia captured in May after a months-long assault, which saw waves of soldiers sent to their deaths like cannon fodder. More recently, last weekend, Ukrainian forces withdrew from Avdiivka, and Russian forces have now taken full control of that town after a similar style of attack. I mean, during that months-long assault on Avdiivka, Ukrainian officials saying that Russia lost 7,000 troops in a single month, 100 tanks, 250 armored vehicles in a single month. I mean, that assault lasted for many, many months. It gives you a sense of what Russia seems prepared to lose for relatively small gains on the battlefield.
Yeah. Just in terms then of the kind of military side of all of this, Jerome, and you touch on some of this, so, excuse me, more spending coming from the UK today as announced by Grant Shapps. We'll speak to him a bit later on breakfast. There's been a real building sense from Ukraine that they really need military funding, military support. I think that's particularly directed at the US, where this $60 billion package is being somewhat held up and floating around in the air without any sort of decision really being made on it. What is the military capability of Ukraine at this point?
Well, Ukraine has a formidable military, it has a formidable fighting spirit, and it has, over the course of the last 2 years, increased its arsenal of modern and sophisticated weapons, thanks to the donations from its international Western and NATO allies. But nonetheless, Ukraine has also paid a heavy price in terms of lives lost and bodies maimed. And its professional cadre of soldiers that started this war, they would have borne the brunt of that initial fighting. They've been bolstered by both the veterans with military experience who were called back to the army and legions of volunteers who signed up in that sort of first wave of furious patriotism that sort of gripped the country. I mean, it seems such a long time ago when it really felt like Kyiv could fall. I was here the day the war broke out. I was a little further east in a town that's now under Russian control, but there was a really palpable sense that the war could be over in a matter of days or weeks, and Kyiv could be captured by the Russians. So it's important, I think, to take stock of the fact that none of that happened. And whilst things haven't gone to plan over the last 12 months as much as Ukraine would have liked, their counteroffensive didn't work. The battlefield on land at least does appear to have stagnated. It's nonetheless extraordinary that Ukraine is still in the fight in the way it is, and not just in the fight, but a level opponent for Russia. Over the last 12 months, whilst Ukraine hasn't seen the gains it would have liked on land, what it has done, its standout successes have really been what it has achieved in the Black Sea with attacks on Russian shipping. We've seen them using both cruise missiles, Storm Shadow and Scalp cruise missiles, which were donated by Britain and France, and also its own domestically produced swarming sea drones to attack vessels both in dock and at sea. And that has forced Russia to move its Black Sea fleet east, away from Crimea, particularly away from the key Ukrainian port city of Odessa. And by doing so, Ukraine has effectively allowed itself to keep trading by funneling merchant vessels close to its shore and then hugging the territorial water of its neighbors once it's out of Ukrainian waters. Yeah. So in terms of, how is the military doing? Ukraine's military has taken they've had a hard 2 years, but they have survived. They're weary, but they appear determined to fight on.
Jerome, it's always so good to speak to you. Thank you very much. Thank you for joining us. Jerome
Thanks.
Starkey there, who is the brilliant defence editor of The Sun. Well, let's speak now to Natalia Gumenyuk, a journalist who investigates war crimes. She joins us this morning from Kyiv. Natalia, good morning to you.
Good morning.
It's fascinating to consider, actually, that while Ukraine's military is fighting on the front line and fighting militarily, actually Ukraine is looking for justice as well when it comes to war crimes, and are logged over 120,000 investigations into war crimes. What can you tell us about those investigations? Is this affecting the whole country, and how can these progress during a time of war?
So the Ukrainian General Prosecutor Office has registered 125,000 alleged incidents of the alleged war crimes. So it's just really about the scale. I'm co-running the project, the Reckoning Project, where on a very different level with the researchers and the lawyers, we talk to the people, in particular the direct witnesses of the war crimes. Would it be the indiscriminate missile attack, or people who lived through tortures, electrocution under the occupation? And just within this couple of years, working all over the country in the liberated territories, talking to the people who came from the occupied territories, in the north, in the south, in the east, we've spoken to over 350 people, and can speak that beyond the reasonable doubt that these crimes are systematic. They are committed in a very similar way in the east, in the north, at different times, at the early stage in the war, like in Bucha or like in Mariupol, and also by now. So the things happening in Bucha might be happening now still in the occupied territories. And in terms of the investigations, I think that, of course, there is the general kind of global dissatisfaction with international justice, and there is understanding that maybe not every person who would be accused would be found, identified, and persecuted. But I still think we're moving rather fast. The fact that a year ago, in March 2023, the International Criminal Court has opened the investigations and issued the arrest warrants against the president of Russia, Vladimir Putin, accusing him on the deportation on the Ukrainian children is rather fast. And our team, we were one of the first to report the story on the separation of the children with their parents. It was still like some months after the war, and for us to see that it happened rather soon, it's pretty reassuring. But of course, we understand that it won't be all people who will be found and identified. But I think Russia a bit underestimated that they are doing this. What they are doing on the territory easily accessible for the Ukrainian international journalists, international prosecutors, not like in Chechnya and in Syria, where internationals and the independent analysts and prosecutors couldn't have access.
What then is the key to Ukraine winning this war?
So for Ukraine, it's very simple. Russia just needs to leave its Ukrainian territory. As easy as that. As long as they leave, that would be enough. And then, of course, in our case, we also can speak about justice, because I think for us, it's very clear that it's not just about the, random crimes or tragic things. It's not about just tragic things which happens during the war, the collateral damage, but it's about the particular criminal acts which happen. So people want some accountability, but also accountability for Ukraine means like avoiding the idea of the revenge. I think Ukrainians kind of admitted that not everything would be investigated, but somehow the emotions, when we move to this idea of possible justice instead of thinking about revenge, which would be really understandable by those thousands of people who lived through incredible horrors.
Natalia, thank you very much for speaking to us. It's a fascinating project that you're working with, and we'll keep in touch. That is Natalia Gumenyuk. Thank you. A journalist running that Reckoning Project, gathering witness testimony from the sites of potential human rights violations and war crimes and atrocities, working with lawyers as well. Natalia speaking to us from Kyiv this morning.